In 2016, on a barrier island off the coast of Texas, a man pulled his truck onto the shoulder of a highway, took out a knife, and cut a piece of tissue out of a dead animal at the side of the road. He was not a scientist. He was a local man named Ron Wooten, and he had been photographing the wild canids of Galveston Island for years, ever since one of them killed his dog. He drove the sample home and put it in his freezer, next to the ice cream and a couple of fish he had brought back from offshore. Then he emailed the photographs, and eventually the tissue, to a geneticist at Princeton. Everyone on the island called those animals coyotes. That is what the state called them. That is what the law called them, which meant a person could shoot one from a truck window any day of the year and never file a form. Wooten had simply never been able to shake the feeling that they were wrong. The legs were too long, the noses were too long, the skulls were too broad. He told a reporter years later that he had assumed at first they must have bred with somebody's oversized dog. They had not bred with somebody's dog. The thing in that freezer was carrying the genome of an animal that the United States government had officially declared extinct in the wild in 1980, and had spent the following 4 decades and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to bring back from a handful of survivors in a breeding facility in Washington State. It would mean less if it were the only one. It was the leading edge of the population, because once the geneticists knew what to look for, they found it again and again. In the marshes of coastal Louisiana, in the refugees along the Texas border, in scat samples, in roadkill, in blood drawn from trapped and colored animals across hundreds of miles of Gulf coastline. The genetic signature of a vanished predator, alive and breeding inside the bodies of the most common wild carnivore in North America. And in the most recent work published this year, something that should not be possible at all. At least one animal that by one analysis may not be a hybrid. This is the space the whole story lives in. It is not exciting. Nobody is claiming a lost species was spotted crossing a road at dusk. The evidence here is sequenced, peer-reviewed, and published in journals. And the argument is not about whether the DNA is there. It is about what to call the animal carrying it, and whether that animal is a coyote, the ghost of a wolf inside it, or a wolf that has been hiding inside a coyote the entire time. To understand what that means, the language has to be made exact, because the common words hide the whole problem. Canis latrans, the coyote, the small, adaptable, wildly successful predator, now living in every mainland state in the country, and Canis rufus, the red wolf, the only species found nowhere on Earth but the United States, an animal smaller than a gray wolf and larger than a coyote. Reddish through the legs and ears, which once ranged across the entire American Southeast. Not a subspecies of anything, according to the agency that protects it. Its own animal. And then a third term, the one that makes this story possible, the ghost allele. When two species interbreed and one of them dies out completely, its genes do not necessarily die with it. They persist, broken into fragments, carried forward inside the surviving species, invisible to the eye, present in the code. A ghost allele is a piece of an extinct animal still circulating in a living population. For decades, it was mostly a theoretical concern. On the Gulf Coast, it turned out to be a landscape. The paper that opened was published on December 10, 2018, in the journal Genes, led by Elizabeth Heppenheimer, with the evolutionary geneticist Bridget von Holt at Princeton, along with Kristen Brzezinski of Michigan Tech, and listed among the authors, Ron Wooten of Galveston, Texas. They took the two roadkill samples from the island and compared them against more than 1,000 genetic markers drawn from 60 animals representing every legally recognized wild species in North America. Coyotes, gray wolves, eastern wolves, and the captive red wolves themselves. The Galveston animals came back primarily coyote, but roughly 30% of their ancestry traced to red wolves. And then the detail that made the finding extraordinary rather than merely surprising. Those animals carried red wolf variants did not appear anywhere in the captive population. Every red wolf alive in the breeding program descends from just 14 founding animals. Whatever those 14 did not happen to be carrying was lost forever the moment the wild population ended. Except it was not lost. It was on an island off Texas in animals nobody had ever bothered to test because everybody already knew what they were. Heppenheimer later described running the initial analysis and thinking sample after sample, just a coyote, and then stopping. How the genes got there is not a mystery, and it is the bleakest part of the story. Red wolves were not driven out of the southeast by wilderness loss alone. They were hunted and poisoned under federal predator control from the late 1800s onward. And as their numbers collapsed, a second thing happened that finished them. Coyotes expanding the empty ground met the last scattered red wolves, and a wolf that cannot find another wolf will breed with what is available. By the 1970s, the surviving population along the Texas, Louisiana coast was no longer a species so much as a hybrid swarm, a blur of wolves and coyotes and everything in between, dissolving in real time. So in the 1970s, the Fish and Wildlife Service made an extraordinary decision. It went into that and pulled the last recognizable red out of the wild on purpose, capturing hundreds of animals, testing them, and keeping the 14 that met the definition. In 1980, the red wolf was declared extinct in the wild. The official position from that day forward was that everything left out there on the Gulf Coast was a coyote. That position held for 38 years, and the scale of what it missed keeps growing. In 2022, a team sampled 31 coyotes in southwestern Louisiana and found red wolf ancestry running between 38 and 62% of the genome, with the oldest, best preserved stretches concentrated in the isolated marshes of Cameron Parish. Much of it on private land, where hunting and trapping are not permitted. Researchers noted something they called strange. The animals carrying more red wolf ancestry tended to be heavier. In February of 2026, a study in Ecosphere went describing these Gulf Coast canids not as a scattering of accidental hybrids, but as a stable, locally adapted wetland ecotype. A distinct kind of animal shaped by red wolf built for marsh country, where ordinary coyotes historically did not live, surviving at high rates and dispersing inland, carrying that ancestry outward into new ground. And a separate 2026 analysis of scat samples found more than half the animals carried at least 10% red wolf ancestry, several above 40%. And one individual by one reading of the data came back at essentially 100%, which raises the question that should have been asked in 1980. If an animal that is genetically a red wolf is walking around Louisiana, what exactly did we declare extinct? And here is why nobody found this for 40 years, which is the part that should change how you think about just a coyote in the country. It was never hidden. It was never rare. It was standing in the open, in daylight, on an airport runway, being photographed by a man with a camera. And it was invisible for one reason. Everyone already knew what it was. Nobody sequenced it. Because sequencing it would have been like sequencing a pigeon. The animal was protected from discovery by its own ordinariness. Wooten only broke because he was not a professional. Did not know it was a stupid question. He kept asking it anyway until a geneticist agreed to look. Which is the objection every skeptic raises here. And it deserves a direct answer. If a critically endangered species is genetically alive on the Gulf Coast, why did 4 decades of professional wildlife management not notice? The answer comes in three parts, and none of them requires a conspiracy. The first is that nobody sampled. Genetic surveys are expensive and get pointed at animals. Somebody has a reason to test. Coyotes are the single most abundant predator on the legally unprotected across most of their range. Nobody funds a genome study of an animal. That is not a question. The second is classification. And the logic is perfectly circular. It cannot be a red wolf. The reasoning runs. Because red wolves are extinct in the wild. Therefore, any wolf-like canid on the Gulf Coast is by definition a coyote. Therefore, it is not tested. Therefore, the extinction is never challenged. The conclusion was built into and it held for 38 years. And the third is that the phenotype is genuinely mislead. Even the researchers say canid appearance is a bad guide to canid ancestry, which is precisely why they were skeptical of Wooten's photographs at first. An animal can carry half the genome of an extinct wolf To a person glancing out a truck window, simply look like a big coyote. Simply look like a big coyote. Honesty requires saying the rest of it plainly. Because the skeptics are right about a great deal. The overwhelming majority of coyotes carry no red wolf ancestry at all. This is a Gulf Coast concentrated in specific coastal parishes, not a national one. Ghost wolf is a nickname, not a nickname, not a taxon. No agency recognizes it. And the animals remain legally coyotes, which means they can be shot on site. The single reported near 100% individual comes from one analysis of scat-derived DNA, which is degraded, difficult material, and it has not been independently confirmed as a living pure red wolf. And the deepest problem is that the taxonomy underneath all of it is genuinely contested. Von Holt herself co-authored a 2016 paper arguing that the red wolf be an ancient admixture of coyote and gray wolf, rather than a separate species, a claim other researchers reject, and one that makes the word purity almost meaningless here. There is also a bitter irony that cannot be waved away. Hybridization with coyotes is what destroyed the red wolf in the first place, and it remains the primary threat reintroduced population in North Carolina, where fewer than 40 animals survive, and managers sterilize to keep the genome from dissolving again. The same process that erased the species is now the only reason parts of it still exist. Because the real claim is more precise than the science does not say the red wolf secretly survived. It says something stranger and better documented. When the United States removed the last 14 red wolves from the wild and closed a substantial portion of the species genome stayed inside coyotes, hidden by a name, unprotected, and breeding. It has persisted for more than 40 years without a single dollar of management. In some coastal marshes, it now accounts for more than half of what is walking around out there. And it is spreading. Carried inland by dispersing animals in a population that officially does not exist because it was filed under a different word. It ends where it began. On a highway shoulder in Texas. A man crouched over a dead animal that everyone had already identified, cutting out a piece of it because it did not look right to him. The state called it a coyote. The law called it a coyote. It went into a home freezer next to the ice cream, and it turned out to be carrying the genetic material that the United States had officially buried in 1980. Tonight, there are animals moving through the marsh grass of the Gulf Coast by the numbers, more wolf hunting nutria in the dark, on ground where their kind was declared gone before most of us were born, wearing the name of something else, and nobody with a rifle or a trail camera has any legal reason to look twice.